2024. My name is Carol Weinshell. I'm the Vice President of Program and Membership at Congregation Rodeph Sholom in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I know you know who I am, but this is for the archives, and the archives don't know who I am. So it just keeps us straight. This is, I believe, the third, maybe the fourth year that we've done this series with our own Rabbi Eisenberg and Paul Friend. This year, it's a little different because Marcia Friend is joining Paul and Rabbi. And we've got a very exciting program called Jews Behind the Scenes of American Cinema. And I dare say you're going to learn a lot. You'll have a few chuckles here and there. And then in 2 weeks, on March 7th, we're going to learn about Jews on the screen in American cinema. So there's a lot to learn about. Everybody doesn't know everything, and we can all learn something. So without further ado, we're going to hear from Rabbi Eisenberg. I'm going to ask you not to unmute yourselves until it's time for any questions and answers, because the distraction in the background is really not good for the program. So, Rabbi Eisenberg, take it away. But you're muted.
Thank you, Carol.
Okay.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. So we're delighted to be able to be with you for this special two-part class on Jews in American cinema, behind the screen and in front of the screen. Tonight is behind the screen. There will be a lot to talk about. And Paul and Marcia Friend. Marcia actually has more expertise. And I'm saying this by their own, by Paul's admission, really. Yes. So Marcia is going to be participating in this. And my introduction to them, well, before I do that, I want to say very briefly that Paul and Marcia and I discussed this in advance about how we wanted this to go. And we don't want, even though it's on Zoom, we really don't want it to be super formal. In other words, we really would love to get people's comments, participation, insights, and we can do that. And Carol, if you said this earlier, forgive me, I was distracted, somebody was texting me, but we can do that by means of, usually it's good just to put something in the chat. Carol will be monitoring the chat. If you're not sure how to do that, there's a little sign at the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, I think. It's probably at the very bottom below all of the video screens. There's a little sign that says reactions with a little smiley face. And you can just click on that and put on, click on a raised hand. Okay, it says raise hand. You see, I'm doing it right now. That's what it looks like.
And the other place, Rabbi, is if you go to the three dots that says more, there's an opportunity to chat and write your comments in there.
Right. And if all else fails and you're having trouble with that, just let Carol know or unmute yourself, put your hand up. We'll unmute you and so you can participate. Okay, but we do have to keep people muted, just so that there won't be too many distractions. All right, now here's my very brief introduction. Paul and I have done a number of these sessions over the last few years, including Jews in Comedy, the Beatles and the Jews. Did we do something on Jews in music, modern? I don't remember. Yeah, yes. Jews in rock and roll.
Yes.
Yeah, we did Jews in rock and roll. Now we're doing Jews in cinema, and there'll be more hopefully in the future as well. But for now, what gives Paul and Marcia Friend the leg up and the knowledge and the credibility? Where do they get their cred? Is it just from seeing hundreds or thousands of movies?
Yeah.
Is it just from watching $1 Million Movie as a child, which was on WOR? Paul, maybe I'll let you tell them the story about the $1 Million Movie theme. But $1 Million Movie, where they on WOR Channel 9, for those of us who grew up around New York, where they would run movies in the afternoon, the same movie in the afternoon, the same movie at night, 7 days a week, pretty much, or almost, right? So that by the time, if you were a movie buff and you liked the movie they put on, for instance, King Kong, right? Which again is another example of a movie that had Jews behind it in terms of the music, the themes. Anyway, if you like the movie like that, you could see it like 10 times, and learn it by heart. But that's their main credibility here, Paul and Marcia, is that they have, I think, for 7 years in a row, you can correct me, taken the Turner Classic Movies. Is it how many years in a row?
9, coming on 10.
Okay, 9 years in a row, they have participated in the TCM Turner Classic Movies. This year, I know it was on the Disney Magic. Yeah. And imagine total movie immersion on a cruise ship.
With this crew.
Yeah. So you can't help but knowing a lot about movies if you go on cruises like that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul and Marcia, and we'll be kind of interacting and interspersing stuff together, and then we'll encourage your participation also. Paul, Marcia, take it away, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. As Rabbi mentioned, Marcia and I have been on all 9 Turner Classic Movie cruises, and I think we are scheduled for the 10th one, which happens right before Halloween. In fact, it comes back to Fort Lauderdale on October 31st, so that'll be the 10th one. And it's true that Marcia is the movie fan and I'm the music fan, but I've learned a lot. And one thing that I learned during our last cruise, which was just in November, was something that I'd never really thought about, should have picked up on it, but didn't. One of the movies that was shown during the TCM cruise was Casablanca. Admittedly, you always see that movie at just about the top of every movie critic's favorite movie / best movie of all time list. But when we saw the movie, they usually almost always have someone speak about the movie either before or after. Often they'll show movies and somebody who is in the movie will actually talk about the movie. One of my favorite examples of that was Ernest Borgnine introducing the Poseidon Adventure. We were on a cruise right before Christmas in somewhat rocky seas, so that was an interesting experience. We also saw Richard Dreyfuss? Yeah, I almost said Roy Scheider. Richard Dreyfuss introduced Jaws on a ship. That was interesting as well. But Casablanca, of course, no one is going to be on who was in the movie. But the speaker, and I don't know if it was Ben Mankiewicz or one of the other TCM hosts, made an interesting observation that really rang a loud bell with me, that you could say that one of the themes of the movies is the experience of Jews in World War II. However, for reasons that I think we'll get into, if you watch that movie, no matter how many times or how closely you watch it, one word you will never hear is Jews. You will hear, I think the word, Marcia, is the refugees this, the refugees that. Well, everyone, or should I say everyone with a brain, knew even at the time who the refugees were, but for various reasons, they, meaning Jews, were not named by name. And I'd never picked up on that before, but it's the kind of thing where once you think about it, it doesn't leave you. It has stuck with me. I've even read a couple of books on the topic. And this all, of course, had to do with, well, it had a lot to do with, gee, are our movies, can we show our movies in Europe? We don't want to alienate that Central European big market for movies. I'm talking Germany. And I believe Casablanca was 1940. America not yet at war. That was another.
42.
What was Casablanca 42? Okay, but when it was made, I suspect it's true that America was not yet at war with Germany or Italy or Japan. And by the way, Marcia will correct me a lot because I need correction. But the point again is this: it's a movie about Jews, but the Jewish name is not mentioned. It's muted, for lack of a better word. So we'll get into what was going on with that. The story, I suppose, of Jews in America, in American cinema, starts like it does with a lot of us, I suppose. The Lower East Side, you had Jews like my grandfather, for example, coming to the United States, emigrating from Central and Eastern Europe in the early 1900s. And as we all know, and it's worth repeating, they did not necessarily have an easy time integrating, deliberate word choice there, into culture. The problem was that Jews were ambitious, wanted to work, wanted to fit in, but had a hard time fitting into what I'll call regular jobs. But something that was available was cinema. And you had a number of people who tried to make it in New York and ended out emigrating or moving out west. Opportunity out there with the nascent and developing film industry. And to kind of put a fine point on this, I'm going to quiz Marcia. I think that she will know the answers to all these. In the 1920s, there were 5 major film studios and 3 minor film studios. And I think you know what I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
Now, so the 5 major film studios, Marcia, can you name any one of them?
MGM, which was all Jews.
And-
Metro was, well, Mayer is Louis B. Mayer.
Yes.
Goldwyn, Samuel Goldwyn.
Yeah.
The Metro part was actually Loew, L-O-E-W. You see his name still in a lot of movie theaters. So what was going on starting in the 1910s with the production of movies is that most of them were being produced by people who owned movie theaters. It wasn't like you had today where people make movies and then they get shown in theaters. It was Loew owned a bunch of movie theaters and he needed things to show. So he started making movies with them. And I think he may have done Westerns or something.
Marcus Loew.
Yeah, Marcus Loew. At some point, as you need more product, you need to fill your movie theaters, he joined up with Goldwyn and with Mayer, where they made MGM, and MGM Lowe's became the movie theater chain, and they showed those movies. And at that time, up until the 1950s, movie theaters only showed the movies that were made by their owners. So if you wanted to see Gone with the Wind, you saw it in an MGM Lowe's movie theater. You didn't go see it at the Fox Theater. There was no Cinemark or Rave or whatever. Can't even think what the AMC movie theaters, whatever. They did not cross brands. If it was a Fox movie, it showed in Fox movie theaters. If it was a Paramount movie, it showed in a Paramount movie theater. If it was an MGM movie, it showed in an MGM movie theater. And that went on until the 50s, when there were antitrust suits to say, anyone who makes a movie on their own can't get it shown anywhere, because all the movie theaters are only showing their own movies, and the government broke that up. So that's a little bit of history on how the studios started. Is the studios started to provide the movies to their movie theater chains. And as is common with Jews, being behind the scenes and going into business, well, we have the movie theaters and we're going to make these studios. And they ended up being the head of almost all the studios were Jews. So you had Louis B. Mayer became the de facto head of MGM.
And Lowe, Mr. Marcus Lowe was part of that.
Well, he was I think more in the distribution. The movies actually, I think he died in the and he died maybe in the 30s. I don't know. He didn't last as long as the others.
He died early, 1927. You
1927.
absolutely
Okay,
correct.
he died even
Okay.
before talkies.
Yeah.
You had Warner. The Warner brothers were Jewish. They were another one of the major studios.
Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack, I think. And I think Jack lived the longest.
But
I think
only one, yeah,
into the 70s.
You had Paramount, which was
Adolf Zucker. It's an interesting pronunciation, Zuckor, but anyway.
Okay, also Jewish.
Right.
You had RKO, which was David Sarnoff, also Jewish. Universal, well, Universal was a minor movie chain at that time. It wasn't one of, did I get the big five?
Yes, I think you did. Yeah, so Paramount we talked about Fox, we talked about MGM, we talked about Warner, and RKO. Marcia, what do you happen to know, maybe unfair, why, so we talked about 5 major studios, names that still reverberate to this day. Why were the minor studios minor? Were they less well funded?
The minor, less funded, fewer movie theaters, not as big of a stable. They didn't have the budget for the kinds of movies that MGM was putting out. For example, when you think of the biggest budget, it would be MGM on their movies. Universal, they started with a name for themselves in the early 30s with horror movies, but they were made very cheaply.
And that was Carl Laemmle.
That was Carl Laemmle.
I
think
I don't know. You may have pronounced it correctly.
I thought it was Laemmle.
You're probably right.
Carl Laemmle. And Columbia was the Coen brothers. Was another one of the
Harry and
studios.
Jack. Yeah.
And then the only studio that wasn't run by Jews was United Artists, which was Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford,
D.W. Griffith.
D.W. Griffith and Charlie Chaplin. Which Chaplin was part Jewish, but it doesn't come through with the others at all.
Yeah, Griffith is a whole other discussion that we won't get into.
So the business end of the studios was run by Jews, and although there would then be a lot of Jewish directors, some Jewish writers, but pretty much any Jewish actor had to change their name.
And why was that? I mean, I think we all can guess.
Yeah, I think that
was it all about market? I assume it was about the marketability, saleability,
yes,
etc.
Yeah. You weren't going to have Schwartzes and Coens and Kleins and being the big stars. So those names were kind of hidden, but a lot of the directors were Jewish as well. So that is a little bit about the studio system.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in for a moment.
Go ahead.
And far be it for me to disagree with my friend Paul Friend, but it's not really a disagreement. It's just, I guess, a point of addition, adding to what Paul said. Not really disagreeing, but in a certain way, I would say that the history of Jewish cinema, and in many ways the history of American cinema, started in Eastern Europe, and to some lesser degree in Western Europe, but mostly Eastern Europe. And mostly the shtetl, where Jews were confined in the Pale of Settlement and were victimized. And some of the earliest studio moguls, I know at least 1 or 2 of them actually grew up, might have been Adolf Zucker, but I know 1 or 2 of them actually witnessed pogroms and witnessed their family members, grabbing any kind of weapon they could find to stave off the pogromists, the Cossacks. The point that I'm making here is many of the early moguls were either born in Europe,
yes,
and came over, most of them
I
actually,
think they were all born in Europe. I don't
Yeah.
know if any of them were born in the US.
possibly all of them. Louis B. Mayer is probably the only one among them. Well, Jack Warner and Louis B. Mayer didn't have much of an accent. So I think Louis B. Mayer, I think, was born in Europe. Not sure about Jack Warner. We'd have to check. But they totally Americanized themselves. But one of the reasons I bring up the European roots is because they came from families that witnessed and were victimized by the pogroms, and they escaped Europe to come to kind of the land of the free and the home of the brave. But they started to realize, as Paul and Marcia alluded to a few minutes ago, that once they came to America, you know, initially it wasn't the Golden Medina that they thought it was going to be, because they, you know, people, the way life was on the Lower East Side, in the sweatshops, in the to be able to eke out a living, to toil, the sweat, the toil was so difficult and oppressive. And to be able to gain some kind of a foothold in America and have and become accepted, these themes, the theme of the underdog, the theme of the persecuted, right? The theme of striving for acceptance, all these themes were very, very powerful in the American cinema, especially in movies like some of the Westerns. It was all over the Western movies, you know, the victory of the underdog, you know, the oppressed, the persecuted, you know, the powerful landowners versus the little guy. And in crime movies, it was there, you know, it was very much there in crime movies. And a lot of these themes were very, very Jewish themes based on the history of Eastern European Jews and the experiences of what it was like to try to be Jewish in America as an immigrant population. But as Paul and Marcia mentioned a few minutes ago, Jews were absent, you know, in the early cinema until the 1940s, really. And there were a few exceptions, very few, but the studio heads actually mirrored their own lives in their movies. And with this, I'll turn it back over to you guys, or maybe open it to others. But the last point I want to make about this is the studio heads assimilated completely, and most of them shed off their Jewishness. And although they might admit that they were Jewish, they didn't wear it on their sleeve. Many of them married out of the faith and did not raise their children Jewish. There's a story that Louis B. Mayer, after he was pushed out of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, essentially, in the early 50s, I believe it was, and led several years, the last years of his life, 5 or 6 years, were very unhappy, miserable, because he had no power or control anymore. And story goes, I think it was in the 50s, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Story goes that he formed a friendship and a relationship with Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who essentially taught him Catholicism for the purpose of conversion. And Louis B. Mayer apparently was on the verge of converting, but pulled back at the very end and did not convert before he died, and died as a Jew and was buried as a Jew. A few interesting tidbits. Back to Paul and Marcia, or anybody else who wants to participate at this point. Paul, Marcia.
I want to tell a one funny Mayer story. I think Marcia knows this one, and then I think we can open it up to questions and stuff. As some of you know, I went to law school in California at UCLA, and one of my classmates was Patty Mayer, and Patty was one of the mayors, but you might say like a cousin, so not a direct descendant, but a part of the family. And I visited her house a number of times. She and her family were very friendly. Visited her house, and of course, she lived in Beverly Hills. Where else? And I remember the first time I was there, in the hallways was a whole set of MGM memorabilia, including, of course, Leo the MGM lion. And
The statue, not the actual.
not an actual lion, but a picture. Yeah, it would have been more problematic if Leo was actually there. And I remember I said something like, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, because it was a large picture, color of the famous Leo the lion roaring. And I recall that I said something like, oh, like, what is that? I meant to say, is it an original? But it came out, because I was so surprised, even though I shouldn't have been, what is that? And she said, without dropping a beat, oh, that's one of Daddy's pets. So I guess you had to be there, but that's my real life MGM story, because it spluttered. I should have said, is that an original? No, what is that? Well, Daddy's pets. So a real MGM story for you. What I want to do is I want to mention a certain book, and then maybe we can open it up a little to people before continuing. And Rabbi, you and I referenced the same book. To kind of underscore everything, I think probably the most famous, if not the best book about Jews in American cinema, was written in 1988. I think the author is Neil Gabler. Yeah, I called it Gabler, but I got corrected, but it's Gabler. What is it called? An Empire of Their Own. How the Jews Invented Hollywood. And the author makes the point, what I call the old money, New England money power structures, New York money power structures, Washington, D.C. political structures were not really open to Jews. But creativity, which is what I think Rabbi was pointing at, and which, kind of think about our discussions about movies and other things we've talked about over the years. Theater, a true expression of creativity, and something that was in its brand new art form that was open to Jews. But as we've also said, the Jewish influence had to be, for lack of a better word, muted. And that's why we're talking about Jews behind the scenes, because they most certainly were behind the scenes. So again, An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood, 1988 book, still in print. I think you can get it from Amazon. No, I don't get any money for referring it, but that is probably the most famous and frequently cited book about the topic we're talking about, which is Jews in American cinema. Now, before we talk more about the concept of Jews being muted, even though they're behind the scenes and owning these various film companies, and again, I referenced my Casablanca anecdote. Does anyone have any questions at this point? I'm looking around and I don't see anything. The Judy Lee is, someone in the Lee is raising their hand in the Lee screen.
Why did the Jews flock to the movie industry?
Let me start with that, then Rabbi, you can barge in. I think, and this is just my guess, reading, and looking back at what things were likely like 100 years ago. It's hard to believe, but looking back in the 1920s, I just finished reading a book by the famous author Bill Bryson, who's written about many topics. He has a interesting and almost unsettling book called 1927, One American Summer. You think things are crazy now? America 1927, not exactly the nicest place for Jews and a lot of people. My point is this: I think that a lot of opportunities that are open to Jews and others today in 2024 were simply not open to Jews. And so what I'm saying, my thesis is this: so many businesses and opportunities and jobs were foreclosed to Jews, and What wasn't was this brand new industry of pictures on screens that were playing. And as you know, as we've discussed in previous sessions, you know, this thing was a burgeoning, beginning, nascent, I think that's the right word, industry. It slowly but surely helped eat up and destroy vaudeville and burlesque. It was something that was new. And if you think about the Jewish creative drive, I think it was something that was open. I can't put it any more clearly. As an example, my grandfather came over on the boat in 1913, and he found employment in the furniture industry and eventually became very successful, owning his own furniture business on Spruce Street in downtown Bridgeport until the early 1960s. And I asked him why he got into the furniture, particularly the dinette business. And his answer was something along the lines of, Paul, no one else wanted to do it, and I saw a need. I saw more people moving into more houses. I saw families growing. I saw a need. And then he repeated, and no one else wanted to fill it. Now, furniture industry, not the cinematic industry, but I can almost, this is somebody, he's a real-time witness to what was going on. Things were blocked that he maybe wanted to do, but there was something that was open. And so I think that that's really why the Jews were able to get into cinema. It was new, like the frontier, figuratively speaking. So
Can I add something to that, please?
go
I think
ahead.
you can't have a discussion on the movie industry without using the word anti-Semitism, which has not been brought up at this point. The Gentiles in those days thought many Gentiles thought movies were beneath them, but the Jews found that it was an avenue where they could have a career, so they went into the movies as directors, actors, etc. And I want to make a point about that. The
Go
point
ahead.
is, you have to see a movie like Gentleman's Agreement.
Yes, 1947.
Yeah.
Which was a movie about anti-Semitism in the publishing industry, but it was really a euphemism for most activities in the United States at that time,
Yes.
other than, let's say, furniture or the movies. But anti-Semitism was a very pervasive and strong factor in this, where causing Jews to make a decision where they would work.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. I totally agree with that. I think, why don't we go to that word, the phrase that you just said, anti-Semitism, and let's confront it head on. We were building up there, so excellent question. I'm glad you raised it at just the right time. I'm gonna, come out with a statement broad-based, and I think it's true. You had Jewish studio heads. Okay, Jews, they own the thing. But there was a fear of showing ethnic Jewish characters. And so you really didn't typically see Jews portrayed. Marcia, like, there's a couple of films I think you know about. Can you tell us about a film called They Won't Forget?
I was going to discuss this
Are
in the
you-
next one. Okay. Yeah, this was Jews in the film.
hit that.
So there's a movie called They Won't Forget, which was 1937, and it was based on the murder of Mary Fagan, which is a famous early 1900s or 1913 trial, murder case and trial, where a Jewish man in the South was basically railroaded and lynched for the murder, even though somebody else did it and I believe confessed later.
Mhm.
But it was a huge anti-Semitic thing. When it was adapted for Hollywood in 1937, they took out all of the Jewish references. It was just a New York man living in the South instead of a Jewish man. A lot of the studio heads did a lot to placate the anti-Semitism, not just for US audiences in the case of like They Won't Forget, where we're not going to bring Judaism or a Jewish person into the movies. And we're not talking about the jazz singer here, which is a different story.
Yeah.
But they also, starting in the early 1930s, had to start placating the Nazis as well.
Mhm.
And they had to eliminate Jewish representation in movies that they wanted to be able to release into Europe. So there were some movies that were just not approved to be released in Germany, or they were blackmailed into making changes to the movie in order to be released in Germany. It started, the first one that's cited, which wasn't necessarily about Judaism, although the author, they said, may have been Jewish, is All Quiet on the Western Front, where it depicted the horrors of war, and they were like, well, you have to change some of this if you want it in Germany, and Goebbels, I think, insisted on changes, like he actually incited riots at movie theaters where it was being shown until Universal cut scenes in it, and edited it down, and Lumley said it was a big regret that he had submitted to those demands. But as things went on, there was a movie called The Rothschilds, which I thought I had the year written down.
Rothschilds or
Rothschilds, whatever, 1934. Well, it's a Jewish banking family, and can't depict them favorably if you're going to release that in Germany.
yeah.
So they actually had to insert a character, a Gentile character, to be their antagonist against these Jewish people and to put them in a less flattering light. The studios kept dealing with Germany until like 1940. It was like pretty late, and a little too late for most of them to say, okay, we're going to stop caring about whether Germany buys our movies to show.
I'd like to add something to that, if I may cut in for a second.
Go ahead.
First of all, I think that the director of All Quiet on the Western Front was Jewish, or at least part Jewish, Louis Milestone. You can check me out on that.
I think Remarque, who wrote it, may have been Jewish too.
And I don't know, we'd have to look that up. But there's one other aspect that I want to say, Marcia, which is, and I think Neil Gabler brought this out in his book, that the studios in the 1930s, in addition to, wanting to show their movies overseas, were also being pressured by the government, the United States government, to keep Jewish themes, Nazi-related Jewish themes, out of the movies because of the isolationist wish and trend to stay out of the war. And the fear it was that if you put too much in the movies about Nazi persecution of the Jews in Germany, that it could rile up enough people stateside to want to lobby for an earlier entrance into the war.
Yeah, well, the first movies that were like kind of pushing to be non-isolationist, like Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, was a big one that would push for non-isolationism, and ends with a big speech of, do something now. And others were like 1940, 41.
Yeah, and even this movie, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, which I think was 1939, doesn't even talk about Jews. And the only movie really, as far as I know, that really addresses Hitler and Nazism was The Great Dictator.
Right.
Which was done by United Artists and not done by a Jewish studio.
Yeah.
Right.
Of which Charlie Chaplin said, I think in the 1960s, that if he knew the real depth of the Holocaust, he might not have been able to make that movie, because he was like, he knew it was bad, but he didn't know how bad it was. But that's true. One
last thing about anti-Semitism, and then I'll shut up.
That's okay.
Again, following up on what Lee said, when it really hit the movie moguls, the Jewish studio owners, was in the late 1940s and the beginning of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, because the Jewish moguls like Louis B. Mayer, Jack Warner, and others were called in front of HUAC, the House Un-American Affairs Committee, to testify and to turn over and to expose socialists and communists within their ranks and who are in their studios writing movies, writing screenplays, or other kinds of things. And I've seen clips of Jack Warner, and Jack Warner is maybe one of the most notable examples, but there were others. Louis B. Mayer is another who, if you see them in movie clips, they exude confidence, and they're the king of the world and everything else. But when you see clips of them being hauled in front of the House Un-American Affairs Committee, they look like scared little puppies shaking in their boots. And this was anti-Semitism. Apparently, the head of that committee, who was a Jew, who was a senator from Mississippi, was a rabid anti-Semite. I don't remember his name, but he was a rabid anti-Semite. And these Jewish movie moguls were smacked in the face now with the power of anti-Semitism as it was manifesting in McCarthyism and the Jew baiting of the Red Scare.
Oh, let me just go back in time. I'll just pick a movie, not quite at random, but here's a great illustration of what we've been talking about the last few minutes. The first movie to ever be nominated for 10 Academy Awards, for double-digit Academy Awards, was 1937, The Life of Emile Zola. I think I pronounced that correctly. And in fact, I think it won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, at the 10th Academy Awards in 1937 and 1938. Okay. It was produced during the Great Depression. The Nazi Party now completely controlled Germany. It's 1937. Anti-Semitism was a big part of the story of Emile Zola. And this movie, again, is called The Life of Emile Zola. Guess what's not mentioned in this movie? Jews or anti-Semitism.
Well, the Dreyfus Affair is mentioned, but they don't mention that he was
Jews.
Jewish.
Yeah. So, imagine it's basically, and I'll exaggerate here for effect. Basically, you're cutting the heart out of the movie, and it did extremely well. It was, as I said, won 3 Academy Awards. It's still considered to be a great biographical film, but it skirted. Marcia, I think you'll agree. It skirted around some key issues. Such as Hollywood in 1937. And I think it had featured Paul Muni. So again, this film, I'm just giving citing one example. It was a big deal. You can imagine what the radio ads must have said. Nominated for 10 Academy Awards. That's a lot, even today. 10 is a lot. But even though the life story of Emile Zola, featured as one aspect of it, a fight against anti-Semitism. As Marcia said, we're talking about the famous Dreyfus Affair, not mentioned at all. What the heck? But I'm sure the accounts at the film company said it did well. It did, what would Variety say? It did boffo box office business, and it was a big
Paul
deal.
Muni was Jewish, of course. The star of the movie was Jewish.
Yeah, and that's just one example. I'm sure there's many, but that's one that just kind of jumped out at me, and it's worth talking about. And as you said before, there was a lot of shying away from discussion of Jews, discussion of the Holocaust, with, of course, the interesting exception of The Great Dictator, the Charlie Chaplin movie, 1940, I think. And I'm not going to look it up, but Casablanca was. I'm mixing up the chronology there, but as I said at the beginning of this program, that's a really classic example. It's talking about Jews, but they're the refugees and never mentioned by name.
And the director of that movie was Jewish.
Yeah, it goes on.
Ortiz.
Now, Marcia.
Yeah, I'm looking up. I just thought of a movie in my head, and I don't remember if Judaism was mentioned in this.
The Dispatch.
Because you mentioned, when you mentioned, about whitewashing Judaism, or whatever term you want to use for that,
Exorcist.
there was a movie about Reuters, a dispatch from Reuters that had Edward G. Robinson, also Jewish, in it. And I don't remember being mentioned that Reuters was Jewish in that movie, and he was. That's Reuters of the news service, and how the news service started.
Guys, with your permission, I want to also interject something based on an earlier question.
Sure.
Like why did the Jews get in, why were they at the forefront, of the Hollywood studio system? Couple of quick points. You alluded to the entrepreneurial flair, of the Jews, entrepreneurial skills. The first generation of immigrants who not only were creative and skilled entrepreneurs, but had that drive to succeed, the drive to become as American as everybody else, even more American than anybody else. Look at, we talked about this in previous classes in the past. Irving Berlin writing God Bless America and writing White Christmas, right?
I love that.
Right. Yip Harburg writing Over the Rainbow, George Gershwin musicals, just the very fact that Irving Berlin wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band in something like 1913 or whatever it was. These guys were more American than Americans, right? But they were deep down. They were at the core Jews, immigrants, right?
Yes.
Who just wanted to be as American as everybody else, and they couldn't do it any other way. They couldn't get into medical school, most of them. They could, it was easier to get into law school, as a Jew, but to get into the professions other than the rabbinate was really tough. So you went into business, you became entrepreneurs. And the other thing about it is the Jews, all of the Jewish movie moguls started out in New York, right? They started their business essentially in New York, but from what I have heard or learned, most of them were driven out of New York. By whom? By Thomas Edison and the early founders of the movie industry. D.W. Griffith also was a part of it, but the earlier Gentile, the non-Jewish movie innovators with Edison at the head, who did not want Jews taking over the industry. So since the industry was based in New York and New Jersey, where were the Jews going to go? They went out west, right? And they established Hollywood. So Sissy has her hand up. Sissy, gonna unmute.
Go ahead.
So where did these new immigrants get financing for this?
Okay, that's a
Go
ahead, Paul.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, I can hear my dad saying cui bono, well, that's who profits, but you have a different question. Who paid for it? I don't know. I don't know what it would have taken to leave the Lower East Side and go out. We all know travel out west wasn't easy. The highways of the time, such as they were, like the Lincoln Highway, if they were primitive. Airplanes like them today didn't exist. It wasn't like you could leave now and be in California in a couple hours. How did they afford it? Don't know. And how they got there, I don't know.
I have a little information about that, Paul.
Go ahead, please.
I think that at least half of them started out in other jobs, other careers, in either the garment industry or other things, where they worked hard and they saved their money, and they were able to use that money, their savings, as seed money to start this new industry. So it didn't, none of them inherited it. And they didn't get it by going to Las Vegas. There wasn't any Las Vegas. They just worked hard. you know?
Rabbi, many of them, a number of them owned movie theaters, and they made movies to fill the movie theaters. Like,
Right.
for example, Lowe's was owned by a Jew, and he filled the movie theaters with the movies that they made. And that's
That's
where they
good.
got their money.
Yeah, that's a good point. But in order to buy the movie theaters, in order to invest, in order to actually get into this industry, many of them started out in other lines of work.
Many of them would have started out in regular theater as well and converted to movies.
You mean like a vaudeville or burlesque or theater?
Well, just a theater, yeah.
Okay.
Or Yiddish theater.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yiddish, any kind of theater and they were converting over to movies. They had their actors, they bought their silver nitrate film or whatever, and were starting to make movies with their stable, as I mentioned earlier, in order to provide the product for the movie theaters to show. And then as they became more successful, they got more theaters and more,
Right.
and then eventually consolidated into Hollywood.
And they also became great and prominent patriots, right? Again,
Yeah,
it was consistent with their wish to be more American than America itself. And they became great patriots, right? But part of that was they couldn't be public about their Judaism. They couldn't be public about exposing Nazism in the 30s and even in the 40s. And even while the final solution was taking place, they couldn't talk about it. They couldn't expose it, right? And again, it blew up in their faces just a few years ago, later, when they were accused of being, of harboring communist sympathizers within their midst.
You know, Rabbi, that reminds me of something that we discussed briefly. And I'll tie a lot of threads together. When I was a kid, I, like probably many of us, loved to watch cartoons. And I remember, especially, I was the type of nerdy guy who would look at the credits for Warner Brothers cartoons. And it kind of hit me, but I didn't think that much of it, that there were so many Jewish names. Like I think which stands for something, Freeling was one of them. Other Jewish Germanic sounding names, but it didn't really make that much of an impact on me. And by the way, I'm talking the Bugs Bunny line. I am not talking about Disney. That's a totally different story that we won't get into. Well, it turns out, because talking with Rabbi, Jews behind the scenes, we could go on for hours, but if you look, there was a significant Jewish influence behind the scenes doing animated cartoons. And as my mom has told me, and others will tell you, back in the 30s and 40s, for that dime, you could get not only your major picture, but your B picture and a newsreel and cartoons. And to tie everything together, one of the few places that you could see anti-Nazi stuff is in certain cartoons. And I think I'm right. Now, I may be confusing timelines. They may be sliding together incorrectly. But, I know that to this day, there are some cartoons, anti-Japanese that will not be shown because they're now considered to be very offensive. If you consider the time when they were made, it was like, anti the enemy, even though they, of course, would use caricatures. You could see Bugs Bunny, kicking Hitler, or somebody dressed like Hitler, or somebody like Tojo or dressed like Tojo. I'd like to think that was perhaps the Jewish experience or influence behind the scenes that led to animated cartoons before and during World War II that were, you may consider them uglyish today, but at the time it was conveying a patriotic message. We're Americans, and we're going to help fight our enemies, which leads to the irony that Rabbi was talking about what happened in the 1950s with the House Un-American Activities Committee. So I just kind of made up a little thread there, but I think there's a lot to what I just said. The Jewish influence in animation was there, but it wouldn't necessarily be well known, except for those names at the end that would flash very quickly. So,
Speaking
Marcia.
of the names, and to tie into other things that were behind the scenes.
Yes.
There was music that Rabbi mentioned, but also a lot of the directors of the time, the biggest directors, were also Jewish. You had Michael Curtiz, he who did a vast array of types of films. I mean, Casablanca is probably his best known, but one of my favorite little like 1932 early color films, or 34 early pre-code color films, Mystery of the Wax Museum, that was later redone as House of Wax, is a Michael Curtiz film. I love that movie.
Vincent Price.
The 1950s was Vincent Price.
Okay.
This was Fay Ray in the 1930s ones, and it's pre-code, where it actually like has someone addicted to heroin and has like a ménage à trois thing in there. It's like definitely pre-code stuff in that one. One of the reasons I like that movie. So, but Fred Zinnemann, George Cukor, Billy Wilder, Mankiewicz's, the whole legacy of them, writers, directors, TCM hosts. One of my favorites also that I like to discuss is Ernst Lubitsch, which we will mention him in the next part too. Ernst Lubitsch, I think he was a Polish Jew, and he made what is a really endearing Christmas movie that has been remade many times, called The Shop Around the Corner, which was remade as In the Good Old Summertime and You Got Mail, and probably a bunch of other things. But it, you know, Ernst Lubitsch usually had Jewish characters in his movies, but he couldn't say that they were Jewish, even in a movie like To Be or Not to Be, which was, we'll get into
Jack Benny.
when we talk about that later, that they're not Jewish in To Be or Not to Be. Not in that version. It was 1942. They couldn't be Jewish. So
I think it was Carol Lombard's last role.
it was, and she died in the plane.
Before she died in a plane crash.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to add about animation.
Yeah.
As everybody here knows, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the first feature-length animated film, 1937. But the next two feature-length animated films were done by the Fleischer brothers, Max and Dave. Gulliver's Travels, who some of us remember seeing, on TV, probably, and another one called Bug or Hoppity Goes to Town, or something like that.
Hoppity.
Or something like that. Okay. And the other thing is, as far as Disney goes, and again, we could talk a whole session just about Disney alone, right? And whether or not he was anti-Semitic or what his hiring practices were. But Disney probably would not have gotten to where he was without the help of Jews behind the scenes. And I can't remember their names, but one of them helped to fund Walt Disney and Roy Disney's early movies, helped them to find the funding for it, for some of their early silly symphonies and the Alice series of movies that Disney started with. And he was a Jewish guy from the East who the Disney brothers came to detest. They couldn't stand him because he tried to take over their business, basically. And the other one was another Jewish guy who, without him, Disney never would have become the international name they were in terms of merchandising. And it's true. Once Disney created Mickey Mouse, it then became all about, how do you merchandise Mickey Mouse? How do you commercialize him and popularize him? By merchandise. And it was a brilliant Jewish entrepreneur, again from the East, who Disney hired to create this wildly successful business venture, which again was a huge part of creating the Disney persona and the Disney name as it became. What about, let Paul go
Whatever
ahead.
makes you say that.
Something about that. It's very important.
Yeah, go
Disney
ahead.
came into a lot of criticism after making Snow White because the witch in Snow White was a stereotype of an old Jewish woman, and people picked up on that. It was he was highly criticized for that.
You know, I've heard that. It's also, you can find on the internet, there's like these interesting discussion threads about, was Bugs Bunny Jewish? Because Mel Blanc interviewed, where'd you get the voice from?
I think he was more based on Groucho Marx, which then you could say, yeah, he was Jewish.
Yeah, Mel Blanc had different stories at different times, but you start to think about it, and I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but you wonder about where Bugs and some of the other gang came from.
Was Porky Pig Jewish? No.
Yeah, but Superman was created, as everybody knows, Superman was created.
Siegel and Shuster, that's a whole other story.
Yeah, Superman was created by Jews.
Oh my, yeah, and you can, and that's a whole other hour of Jews and comic books.
Paul can do Jews and comic books.
No, but
I'll fall asleep.
and that comes in the public domain in 15
We
years.
should let people. We should let people make comments or questions. But also, I just want to reference real quick before I'm done with my part. There were also lots of Jewish screenwriters. So.
Yes.
There were several people creating screenplays.
Joyce
and
and Philip Epstein.
Excuse me?
Yeah, the Epstein brothers.
Yeah, Epstein did Casablanca. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So there were lots of Jewish screenwriters, but also, as many of you know, Hollywood, the movie moguls, brought in several prominent novelists who were not Jewish. Like I think Faulkner and was Fitzgerald one of them? I don't remember. But some novelists who were brought in to create screenplays for some of the movies. Okay, I think we should, yeah.
Yeah, I think we could let some people make comments who haven't made comments already. Yeah. Would be good to hear.
I'll start off with anybody who has not said anything or asked anything, or just make a comment.
Anybody?
While you're thinking of it.
So, Rabbi, I was just going to say, thinking about the cartoons and the television and the movies, certainly in the early 50s, when I was growing up, first of all, we didn't get to the movies, and our ability to watch television was a small black and white.
Right.
And I can say that we never thought about whether the person was Jewish, what the undertone was, if it was anti-Semitic, if it wasn't, if it was funny and it made you laugh. It did. I mean, we just didn't see that for whatever reason, whether we weren't brought up with it, whether it, I just.
Carol, I think part of that may also be that we were brought up, most people who are 60 plus were brought up basically where almost all television and all entertainment was white Christian based, and you didn't necessarily think about whether it was anti-Semitic or whatever. Right. It was just that was the plain norm, and they didn't show any other types of people.
That's
and yes,
right.
It was legitimately funny, and some of it could be racist, but some of it was just homogenized to be that's what you put on the screen.
And so it isn't until now that you're talking about it and dissecting it that I can look back 70 years, to when I remember watching television, whatever it was, that, there was another meaning there that we just didn't get. But as a 5-year-old, we weren't going to get that.
Did you hear Jack Benny is Jewish or Milton Berle is Jewish or? No, because they just had to present as white male.
I always knew that.
Yeah.
Because that's my grandparents, my grandmothers in particular, not my grandfather, my grandmothers were just so proud of them that they were Jewish. You know, that's, I mean, Jack Benny and Milton Berle, oh my, for sure. But, you know, beyond that, we just didn't hear this one's Jewish, this one isn't, this is anti-Semitic, this isn't. I mean, Snow White, to be honest with you, was Snow White. There was nothing evil or bad. That isn't what we heard. It's not what we learned. So I just wanted to put that out there. If anybody else wants to comment on that, it would
Yeah, I
be
want to comment
totally.
because Judy just reminded me, there's a theory that Snow White, the character, was based on Hedy Lamarr in appearance. No, I don't know if that can be proven.
No, that can, Hedy Lamarr,
I thought that was a done deal.
Go ahead.
Snow White.
Yeah, I have to look it up. I've heard that.
Okay.
That,
Let's check.
but I'm not sure that's true. But I've heard that there was a rumor, a theory that, and Hedy Lamarr, of course, was Jewish, as we all know. Maybe we'll bring up Hedy Lamarr next time. Also, we haven't really even talked too much about, you know, Jews in more modern cinema, like Steven Spielberg and, you know, the producers like David Geffen, and I mean, there's so many.
Right. But I think it's, we've been talking about how Jews, not mentioned in movies. I think that one of the first movies, there's a little story behind this, that have Jewish characters. One of it was 1947, post World War II. That's not an accident. Marjorie Morningstar.
Mhm.
And I think,
Well, The Jazz Singer, 1928, is
Nope.
probably the most identifiable.
right, but and that was also one of the first talkies. Am I correct
Yes.
about that? But actually, in addition to Marjorie Morningstar, perhaps more important, Gentleman's Agreement, 1947. That was perhaps the first. Yeah, I kind of jumped the gun with Marjorie Morningstar. Gentleman's Agreement was what I wanted to mention. It highlighted anti-Semitism.
But yeah, it was more about
explicitly.
anti-Semitism than, I mean, the character isn't actually Jewish in it, but it highlights.
Gregory Peck.
It's a film about
Yeah.
anti-Semitism.
And kind of like The Life of Emile Zola in 1937, Gentleman's Agreement won the Academy Award for Best Picture of 1947. And what's interesting about that movie is the legend. I can't verify if it's true, but I have read that the film was pushed by Daryl Zanuck, not a Jew. After he was refused admission to the Los Angeles Country Club because people thought that he's a studio head, he must be Jewish. And Mr. Zanuck, so upset that he was discriminated against because people thought he was Jewish, gave the go-ahead for Gentleman's Agreement, which I did not.
And it was directed by Elia Kazan, who is not Jewish. And one of the main themes of that movie is that it's a movie against anti-Semitism, but the strange twist of that is that it brought forth the theory that it's fine to be Jewish if you're like everybody else. So that the Jews in that movie, being Jewish in that movie meant being totally assimilated and being like everyone else and not having any distinctive, in fact, there were references in that movie to distinctive Jewish characteristics, like Gregory Peck having dark hair, or darker complexion, whatever. So it was almost like, yes, Jews should be equal to everybody else and should not be discriminated against, right? But it's easier if Jews are like everybody else, and look like everybody else, and talk like everybody else.
And it kind of to that point, if you go into the 50s, I think that for the first time, and Rob, I'll exaggerate for effect. In the 1950s, you start to have movies identify characters as explicitly Jewish. But they're famous characters. I think Moses in the Ten Commandments, the 1950 Jewish. Or Judah Ben-Hur in Ben-Hur,
He was Jewish.
a story of the Christ, is Jewish. But these characters explicitly identified as Jewish. Even
biblically Jewish. I mean, come on.
But still identified as. I believe
Ben-Hur converted.
The diary, but that's not important now. The diary of Ben-Hur. The diary of Anne Frank.
The ending of Ben-Hur.
Stop. The Diary of Anne Frank. I believe that in that movie, the Frank family is explicitly noted as being Jewish. So this is in the 1950s, I think, with the dawn of the civil rights movement. And I understand, but this was perhaps the first time where you started to see characters, whether historical or not, expressly or explicitly identified as being Jewish. And I think I'm onto something there. You weren't really seeing that before. So Carol, that goes to your point. You're watching TV and it's not necessarily going to be an issue, but in these movies, and these are all big epics, or relatively high budgeted films. It's the first time you see characters expressly being identified. And I think even the Ben-Hur one, I understand your point, but I think even that, at least the character is Judah is identified, at least at the start, as being Jewish.
I just thought about a kind of a throwaway line in the movie Anti-Main, which was late 1950s. There's something where she's her adopted son is marrying or going to be marrying a daughter of these extremely bigoted Connecticut or people, and they're talking about like a Jewish violinist, and during the movie one of the characters get pregnant, and because the production code was still in effect, it turned out she'd married but she'd forgotten about it, so she was not an unwed mother, God forbid. Well, in the original book, I remember in order to get back at these people, Mame finances a home for unwed mothers next door to them. But in the movie, she finances some type of like Jewish violinist conservatory right next to them. So although it was not acceptable to have an unwed mother in the 1950s, the thing to shock and dismay people would be to put something Jewish next to them. So just a little interesting throwaway on that.
And Carol, with your permission, the last thing I want to say is that since you brought up the movie The Diary of Anne Frank, I think from 1959. Yeah. Which was very much antiseptic portrayal, in the sense that there is nothing in that movie that, it's almost kind of like a romance, a little romance kind of thing. There's nothing in there about what happened after they're captured and after they're taken to concentration camps and how they die in the concentration camps. American movies were not portraying that or dealing with that. The only movies that were dealing with it were the first movie, to my knowledge, that really dealt with that was a 32-minute documentary in 1956 called Night and Fog by the great French director Alain Resnais. But American cinema was not dealing with it. Okay, it was just dancing around it, skirting around it. Yep. And it started to get into it a little bit, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, with two notable movies of the early 60s, the Judgment at Nuremberg, which I think Judy Garland might have won an Oscar for, but you'll have to check me out on that one.
I think she did.
Yeah. And The Pawnbroker, the great movie The Pawnbroker, with Rod Steiger. But a lot of people were not going to see The Pawnbroker, and anyway, it took a long time for American cinema to catch up. Carol, I'm going to throw it back over to you because our time is ending pretty
Okay.
soon. And I don't know
I
if anybody
did,
else
I,
has comments,
I
but-
wanted to just add about the Anne Frank movie. And I don't know where this was made. I don't know when it was made, but I've seen it in the last year. Was A Small Light. And this took a whole different
Great movie.
approach. It followed Meep guys to the point that I will tell you, it was part of why I'm going to Amsterdam next month, actually. I knew nothing about her husband. And I don't want to say too much, but it was astounding to see what big a part, is that right, Rabbi? What big a role he had in trying to save the Franks, even though that didn't happen. We never, I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but I never heard that there was a husband and never knew what he did. And if you get the opportunity to watch it, it's on, I think it's National Geographic. It was one of those movies I couldn't stop watching, and I really learned a lot from it.
Not only the husband, but the other office workers
Yes,
of Leo Frank's employees.
yes.
As well.
Yeah, I was stunned, really and truly. So before I end, because it is time, does anybody have anything else? Then I'm going to thank Paul and Marcia again for coming and doing this program with Rabbi Eisenberg. The three of you are just wonderful. I could see as I was watching everybody's faces and trying to track who's here and not, that everybody really enjoyed this, and I think learned a lot. So save the date, March 7th. That's in 2 weeks, same time, same channel. You provide your own refreshments. That's the advantage of Zoom for me, who would be providing. And again, I see one hand. Do I see a hand? Okay, so I
Carol,
thank you. Yes.
Paul, Marcia, and I are the three musketeers. Athos,
Yes.
Porthos, and Aramis. That's us, the three musketeers. And Carol Weinshell is D'Artagnan.
Oh,
Or D'Artagnan. I can't pronounce French. We're the
As
four
lo-
musketeers, you guys.
as
And
long as you don't take away my role as partner in crime with you,
I
I'm
never
okay.
would. And it was
Okay.
great to have Rabbi Nelson and Alicia with us also, as always. Rabbi Nelson, did we get anything wrong that's blatantly wrong? I like to say, can we be stand corrected on anything that's blatant?
You guys are so knowledgeable. It's great, great. I just had a memory of going to Main Street where there was a theater. I forget the name.
The
Maybe it just
Merit.
Merit.
and watching all Sunday afternoon. I mean, I was studying Torah most of the time, but I would take time off on Sunday.
Carol, it
movie-
might have been the Rialto.
Yeah, the Rialto was
Yeah,
further
was it
down.
downtown
by
or up
Charles
north?
Street.
Was it a dime? Alicia remembered paying a dime in Chattanooga for a movie.
Rabbi Nelson, was it
I
in the
can't
north?
believe that.
Was it in the north end or downtown?
Downtown.
Oh,
And then there was
then
one across from the Rodeph Sholom Cemetery, a theater. My mother loved movies, so she.
County
Wait,
Cinema.
Wait,
County Cinema.
wait,
What is it?
wait. Across
County
from
Cinema.
the Rodeph Sholom Cemetery. Take me
Yeah,
back for a minute.
Fairfield, somewhere. What was the
Yeah,
name of
County
the theater?
Community?
Yeah.
No.
County Cinema, the
No,
county
no,
cinema was
County
across
Cinema.
from the cemetery.
You go way
Right,
up there.
the county cinema.
They had
That's
99
right,
cent
Paul.
movies,
99-cent movies.
Okay.
What was it
You
called?
guys
It
were
was
great. It
called
was
the
a fabulous
county
program.
cinema.
Okay.
And
Okay.
Rabbi Nelson,
Right.
don't forget the Los Poli.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
We
Right.
had a lot, didn't we?
We
Yeah.
did.
We really did.
Oh,
Okay,
this has been fun. Thanks, everybody.
okay, thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you.
Thank
See
you.
you in
Good
2
Thank
weeks.
you.
Thank you.
You very
Great.
much.
Thank you.
If anybody wants to stay on just to schmooze for a few minutes, feel free, just for a couple of minutes.
All right.
It's
Yeah,
fine.
All right. The
Paul and
friends are
Marcia,
gonna,
thank you. We never told our Gone with the Wind story.
Paul will do that.
I'll
next
save
time.
it for next time.